from Judas Maccabeus onwards, ultimately discovered, would lead to absolute catastrophe, to the entire people being hoisted on stakes or crucified. And of course, 30, 40 years after the story of Jesus, that's exactly what happens. Jerusalem is destroyed, the temple is razed to the ground, and a temple is dedicated to Jupiter on the site. And the galut, the diaspora, the forced exile of the Jewish people, yet again is inaugurated. So in order to get away from this false dichotomy that I think has really bedeviled a lot of Muslim as well as Christian perception, the Muslim idea that, well, if Jesus can't really have been that kind of fluffy pacifist, why didn't he speak out against Roman tyranny? What sort of ridiculous, amoral rejection of the duty to speak out, at least, against the suffering of his people was that? To Muslims, the pacifism of the gospel has historically looked very unethical. That's a stereotype that needs to be rejected when you consider the situation those people were in. In that situation, it was pacifism or annihilation. Similarly, the polemic that sees the origins of Christianity as pacific, that Jesus is a kind of hippie-like, long-haired figure waving a daffodil, wandering around preaching peace and love as if it was something from a 70s musical, contrasted with the wicked Arabs to the south with the bloody scimitars, is not right either. And the way to bring them together is to look at the way in which the two traditions, once they'd drawn breath and were able to process their founding stories, and were able to reflect on the moral paradoxes intrinsic in existing as a human community, and sometimes having to use force internally, you have to have a police force, and externally, you're likely to need an army. As human communities are reconciled to that necessity of human collective life, we actually see the theory in the two civilizations really converging. And there's been a number of studies by somebody called John Kelsey in the United States, and some others as well, which have shown that in fact the medieval Muslim theory of jihad substantially overlaps with the medieval Western Christian theory of just war, in terms of what you're allowed to do and not allowed to do in war, and also in terms of when war is legitimate and when it isn't. And lo and behold, Islamic law says you can't fight a war or start a war if the odds are evidently insuperable. So the Muslim polemic against Jesus the pacifist goes up in smoke, because he did exactly what a Muslim would do in that scenario. Similarly, a Christian opposition to the Prophet, fighting to defend his people in Medina against the idolatrous hordes of Mecca, similarly goes up in smoke, because all of that can be seen as just war. And in fact, one of the underestimated facts about the life of the Prophet is that even though his life and his campaigns united Arabia, the first time that had ever been done, an area the size of the Indian subcontinent and full of warring tribes, way beyond the time of Herodotus, before the dawn of time, they'd always been in a state of vendetta against each other. That was put an end to by the Prophet's campaigns. And it seems that the total death toll for that was about 1,000 people. Muslims have sort of heroic memories of some of the battles of the Prophet. The Battle of Badr, the Battle of Uhud, the Battle of Hunain, and you'd almost think that this is like the Battle of Waterloo or the Battle of Hastings, but in fact these were small skirmishes. The Battle of the Khandaq, which is certainly one of the turning points in world history, if you like, the point where the Meccan invaders are finally dissuaded from capturing Medina. It seems maybe 13 or 14 people died during that battle. That's one of the great battles of history, but 13 or 14 casualties. That also helps us, I think, to reduce this polarity that many people have, that Jesus is about peace and Muhammad is about war, and therefore this is Isaac and Ishmael, it's all irreconcilable, and therefore now we can understand why there isn't peace in the Middle East. In fact, the two stories are, in terms of their serious moral reflection, pretty similar. Now, medieval Muslims, in figuring out the ethics of war, needed to have something to say about human nature. If human beings, left to their own devices, are benign, then it's going to be difficult for religion to sanction a systematic use of force, either internally or externally. However, even though Islam, as I mentioned, doesn't buy into at least the Western Christian understanding of original sin, it is fairly sanguine about human nature. Left to ourselves in a kind of Hobbesian state of nature, we do tend to be very predatory. Witness the fact that whenever there's an earthquake or some other natural disaster and the police are disoriented for a while, looters immediately appear. That seems to be something that is there in human nature. There does need to be what Islam calls a wazi', that is to say a barrier, something that restrains human beings from predating on each other. And that's actually Quranic. Surah 22 verse 40. But for God's repelling some people by means of others, cloisters and churches and oratories and mosques, wherein the name of God is often mentioned, would surely have been thrown down. What is this God's repelling some people by means of others? And they say it's because some people are prepared to use force. Without that, the mosques and the churches and these other places cannot exist. We will be in the state of nature, the law of the jungle. There's a Sufi poet, Jalaluddin Rumi, 13th century, who says this: knowledge and wealth and office and rank and fortune are a mischief in the hands of the evil-natured. Therefore the jihad was made obligatory on true believers for this purpose, namely that they might take the spear point from the hand of the madman. Who is it, however, who has this obligation and this right? Who can declare a jihad? Who can rightly bear the spear point in order to preserve God's order from destruction? Well, in classical Islamic theory, everything is centered, focused on a particular individual, the Khalifa, the Caliph. As the reality of Muslim political fragmentation dawned, and everybody could see from the 3rd, 4th century onwards that the ideal of a pristine, seamless, single garment of the Muslim world was unlikely ever to be recreated, pragmatic theologians and legal theorists recognized that it wasn't just the caliph, the titular head of the religion, but other authorities and rulers who could claim the mantle of imam, that is to say, the leader of the Muslim community, and who could justly exercise this responsibility of jihad. How is it that they have the right to do this, given that the taking of a life seems to be very close to trespassing on God's own territory? God is al-Muhyi al-Mumit in the Quran. God is the one who gives life. God is the one who brings about death. How can human beings do that without idolatrously claiming for themselves one of the names of God? Well, here the theorists would say only somebody who is a virtuous, ideally perfected human being can do that. If the ego is involved in jihad, then calamity will result. If the spirit, that is to say the Adamic perfection, the original form, the saintly part of humanity, is in the driving seat in the human soul, then the result will be justice. Because then the human being will not be pursuing his own ends and his own whims, but instead will be doing the will of God. Therefore, it is assumed that a preparation for engaging in just war is some kind of spirituality. And here is another area where Islam's spiritual metabolism looks strange to those who are familiar with Western European understandings of how religion works. The idea of holy war and of sacred warriorhood are peculiar. Now, it's true the word jihad doesn't mean holy war. It just means a struggle. Holy war perhaps is closer to the bellum sanctum, which was one of the official designations of the Crusades. Pope Urban, when he started the First Crusade, said this is going to be a holy war, bellum sanctum. Islam doesn't quite use that category. But still, it's fair to say that the warrior should be holy. The war can't really be holy, because the jurists say it's hasanun li husni ghayri.